Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Duke Initiative for Science and Society for the next installment of our coronavirus conversation series, co-hosted today with the Duke University Center on Risk and Harvard University's for Bioethics. My name is Sarah Rispin, and I'm a senior fellow at Science and Society here at Duke University. In a moment, I'll introduce the speakers and moderators for today's event, which will examine the science and ethics of using human challenge trials for developing COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. But a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions for our panelists, please send them to Ben Shepard using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. He'll redirect those questions to our moderator, who will try to address as many as possible. Please make sure to keep your video off and your microphone muted throughout the event. And if you happen to lose connection at any point during the event, you can rejoin by clicking on the link in the email you received earlier today. After the event, I invite you to visit the Science and Society website at scienceandsociety.duke.edu to learn about our upcoming coronavirus conversations. Of note is our conversation this Thursday, August 27th, also at 4 p.m., which will discuss racial bias in the healthcare system and how it's impacted COVID-19 treatment outcomes for people of color. And on Wednesday, September 2nd, we're holding a coronavirus conversation on the ethics considerations around dating, relationships, and sex, the pandemic. While you're on the Science and Society website, you can also learn about our master's degree program, where our students and faculty go in depth on these exact science, technology, and ethics issues that we have been discussing in the past few months in our coronavirus conversation series. Please allow me to introduce our panelists. Dr. Mark Lipsitch is a professor of epidemiology, immunology, and infectious disease at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where he is also the director of the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics. He researches acquired host immunity, vaccine-induced immunity, and other public health interventions on the population biology of pathogens and the consequences of changing pathogen populations for human health, all in the current pandemic. Dr. Nir Eyal, a frequent collaborator of Dr. Lipsitch, is a professor of bioethics at the Rutgers School of Public Health and the director of the Center for Population Level Bioethics at Rutgers. His work focuses on population bioethics, including such topics as equitable resource allocation, ethical issues in health promotion, and ethical issues in research on human participants. Dr. Cameron Wolfe is an associate professor of medicine and clinical expert in respiratory and infectious disease at the Duke Medical School and Duke Hospital. His research has had a particular focus on transmission of infectious disease in the transplant and other surgical contexts. Since the start of the pandemic, he's looked at numerous COVID-19 related questions, including how to adequately sterilize PPE that had to be reused in the face of resource shortages, the issues surrounding the FDA's emergency use authorization for remdesivir, and whether and how to safely bring athletes back to school. Dr. Wolfe spoke in June for a prior coronavirus conversation regarding the progression of the disease, the effect on patients, and the status at the time in June of treatments for COVID-19. So we thank him for joining us again today. And our moderator today is Professor Kim Kravick, who is the Catherine Robinson Everett Professor of Law at the Duke Law School. Much of her current research analyzes what she calls taboo trades, exchanges that are contested by society and in some cases forbidden altogether. She has written on commercial surrogate and sperm market sex work. At the moment, much of her work is on incentives for organ donation. Although financial incentives are part of the menu, she's most interested in non-financial incentives such as kidney swaps, need chains, NEAD chains, and priority systems that provide an incentive to donate. And with that, I'll yield the floor to Kim to begin this very important conversation on human challenge trials.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today, and especially to our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise. Today's topic is COVID-19 challenge is both a timely and a controversial topic. Almost since the start of the pandemic, there has been talk about a challenge trial with experts, including our panelists, debating the ethics, the science, and the possible design of such a trial. Young people around the globe have signed up to put themselves at risk. As of this morning, over 35,000 people from 160 countries had registered as potential challenge trial volunteers through One Day Sooner, which, as some of you may know, is an organization that advocates on behalf of COVID-19 challenge trial volunteers. Adrian Hill of the University of Oxford, whose lab developed one of the leading COVID-19 vaccine candidates, has announced plans to produce virus strains and conduct a challenge trial. And within the last 2 weeks, Dr. Anthony Fauci announced that US researchers will create a strain of the coronavirus that could be used in possible challenge trials, though he emphasized that he did not expect challenge trials to be necessary here given our unfortunately high infection rate. So I'd like to first turn to our panelist, Harvard epidemiologist Mark Lipsitch, to set the stage for us a bit. Mark, what is a challenge trial and how does it differ from a phase 3 trial? Can you just enlighten on some of these basics first?
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to address such an interesting and distinguished and diverse group of people. So the normal way that vaccines are developed most of the time, they're tested for safety and then for their ability to create an immune response in phases 1 and 2 respectively. And then in a phase 3 trial, individuals, large numbers of individuals in the thousands or more often tens of thousands, are randomized and given either the candidate vaccine or a placebo or a comparator, and then sent back out into the world to live their normal lives. And some of them are exposed to the virus, in this case a virus, some of them are not. And the participants are monitored to find out whether they get sick, detectably sick, and then if they are sick, they are tested to see if the thing that made them sick was the virus that you're trying to prevent. And so whether the vaccine candidate protects against disease. There are other things you can learn, but that's the basic setup. In a challenge trial, again, you go through the phase 1 and 2 safety and immune response steps as you would before a phase 3 trial. But in a challenge trial, the idea is that you deliberately infect individuals in the trial after they've normally been randomized to either get the vaccine candidate or a placebo. There are other variants where maybe that we can talk about later, but that's the standard setup. So again, you have randomization of individuals, but this time you bring the infection to them. What you learn from a challenge trial is a bit different. You learn about infection typically, rather than and that means that you are watching them in the very early phases. Even, we'll get into this too, but even though there is no perfect for SARS-CoV-2 infection right now, there are treatments you can give that would make the infection artificially shortened. And so you learn about the early phases of the infection and whether the vaccine is good at preventing or modifying that early infection phase. So they provide complementary different kinds of information, and the obvious considerations include that a vaccine trial of the phase 3 type works best transmission going on so that there are lots of exposures and you can do statistics on the results. And a challenge trial has the advantage of being feasible even when transmission is not common, as you hope it will not be because of control measures. Another consideration is that in a phase 3 trial, very wide diversity of people, including those who would potentially get very ill if they got infected. While in a phase 3 trial, you would do that. While in a challenge trial, you use smaller numbers of people, and you would focus the trial exclusively on individuals who are at very low risk of known bad outcomes. And so you try to minimize the risks to the volunteers, although they are clearly consenting to something that's much more risky than a participation in a regular phase 3 trial. So so they do different things. The need for real understanding of the risks is different, but it's different in degree rather than kind. So those are some of the differences. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to ask our next question to our bioethicist, Mrna Vaccine. Mrna, can you explain a little bit about how a challenge trial would fit within the COVID vaccine roadmap, just building on what Mark just told us? In other words, do we expect it to replace phase 3 trials, to work in with them? Exactly how does this alter the landscape that we're sort of more familiar with in terms of vaccine development and testing?
Thank you, and thanks a lot for the invitation to join you. It could fit in different ways. When Mark and I and Peter Smith from London wrote together the first peer-reviewed article calling for challenge trials for assessing the efficacy of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, we were envisaging them as replacing efficacy kind that Mark mentioned, basically to save a lot of time, especially in the event that these phase 3s encounter problems, getting enough cases to reach meaningful, statistically meaningful results, as was the case in the Oxford group's trial in the spring. That's why they are now working in the US and Brazil and South Africa. I think the Oxford group is seeing the same potential. That's partly why they want to conduct a challenge trial, although they are leading the pack outside, if we don't count Russia and China, who give up on doing phase 3s and circumvented everybody. Among the some serious researchers who want to do some efficacy testing, they are ahead and they still want to do a challenge trial because of the time savings. So we were thinking it could just replace phase 3 in the circumstances, although phase 3 generates certain forms of very useful, important information, mainly safety. We could discuss that. There are also other ways of combining them. So some people have envisaged challenge trials as a way to weed out a lot of vaccine candidates before getting into this very expensive, very prolonged phase 3, because we'll have a lot more vaccines coming up after these first wave of vaccines that we're testing. There are still well over 150 vaccine candidates out there that we'll want to examine. Maybe one of them will be even more efficacious. Maybe none of the current vaccines is going to turn out to deliver cheaper, force the producers of the current vaccines to reduce prices. So we want to continue to test a lot of stuff, and challenge trials could help us make that quicker. Colleagues Brian Strom, Toby Gerhardt, and I are currently working on a scheme whereby the two trial types complement each other. So, for example, imagine the following situation. Oxford or J&J or whoever failed to quite reach statistical results in their phase 3. If they do a quick challenge trial during that time or quickly after that time, that could give them all the efficacy data they need, and in addition, through the phase 3, they get a lot of important safety information. I think the trial has some problems generating results about high-risk patients in the challenge trials because, as Mark mentioned, for safety reasons, we would exclude anybody who's at high risk for severe results in the event of infection. And in phase 3, it's less often recognized effectively. High-risk populations will self-isolate zealously, and we would have very few cases of exposure of any formally registered participants. So either type of trial has some problems generalizing them. If you conduct a challenge trial, you could try to glean through them more easily than in a phase 3 the correlates of protection, what characterize participants in whom the vaccine worked well. And then you could follow it up as WHO working group on this issue recommended with a short and relatively safe immune bridging study, which only gives high risk, which were excluded from the original study or effectively didn't participate in the cases so much. Give them just a vaccine and see quite quickly whether that correlate of protection arises in them. That would be a pretty good signal as to the outcomes, and that might be our best chance of gleaning the impact of the vaccine candidate on these broader populations.
Okay.
So there are different ways of combining them.
Great, thank you. I actually do want to come back to a couple of issues that both you and Mark raised, especially with respect to statistical significance that I want to follow up on. But first, I would actually like to ask Dr. Wolfe, who is on the front lines of this epidemic and possible treatments, if he could bring us up to speed in terms of where we are for COVID vaccines, and treatment development. In other words, I'd like the audience to have a bit of a sense of what the stakes are here in terms of treatments and vaccines and where we stand now.
Yeah, and I'd love to say thank you also for the invitation. It's a pleasure to sit beside Mark and Nia and talk about these things. So thank you for the invite. I'll maybe start with the vaccines and then get into the therapeutics after that, if it's easy. You know, as was mentioned, we're currently looking at more than 150 vaccines that are in various preclinical all the way through until approved stages of development. I think you can pretty quickly talk about the two that in theory have gone past or skipped over stage 3. You know, there's both virus vaccine where we really have very little clarity over what sort of safety and efficacy data is available for that. So I won't go further into that. Suffice to say that there are plenty of other adenoviral vaccines that we are investigating. And then there's also a Chinese vaccine, which really is in phase 3 as best as I can evaluate rather than 4, but it's being released, it's being used more widely, and its company is CanSino Bio. So with those two as exceptions, I think the focus probably is better deserved at looking at phase 3, and at least outside of the Chinese market, they really focus predominantly on 3 that people will be familiar with. The main one that's sort of, I guess, been front and center of the news here, at least domestically, has been from Mrna, a company that's been partnering with the NIH to look at an mRNA vaccine. They launched their phase 3 trial, I think, in late July 27th, if I'm not mistaken, and certainly preliminary data looked very respectable for both its safety profile in small numbers. As Mark said, you know, phase 1 and phase 2 are principally interested in safety and stimulation of an immune system response, and it looked comparable to what you might anticipate for someone who is a convalescing, recovering individual. Pfizer, in combination with a German company called BioNTech, have also launched an mRNA vaccine and rolled out into phase 3 trials in the United States as well. Really similar efficacy and safety endpoints that they're trying to shoot for, and on quite a similar target, I guess, timeline-wise for comparison with Mrna. And I'd say with both of those, you know, something to bear in mind is not only have we never had a humanized coronavirus vaccine before, so all of these are creating a very different process for us. We've never had a humanized mRNA vaccine targeting anything, as best I'm aware of. So this is, both of those companies are really very much on a cutting edge pathway to try and come up with a trajectory we haven't yet faced. The third vaccine, which was mentioned a little bit by my colleagues earlier on, is a sort of a fused effort from the University of Oxford and now AstraZeneca. It is a different vaccine. It combines a chimp adenovirus sort of carrier, for want of a better phrase, with spiked proteins from coronavirus, and attempts to use it in a different fashion. It's also in a phase 3 trial, both in the United States, in Brazil, it was mentioned, and elsewhere in Europe, where perhaps to some extent the number of cases has declined. So I think all of those 3 are sort of looking at a phase where they're interested in, and then those individuals go forth and We follow up to see if they get meaningful infection, and we track the durability of their immune response too. That's really unknown at this stage. The other phase 3 vaccine based from Chinese companies, and while some of them are being trialed outside of China, they're worth briefly mentioning. There are a couple from the Wuhan Institute which are moving forward into phase 3. Sinopharm and Sinovac are a couple of different companies that are both in phase 3 development. And actually an Australian company, Australian Institute, the Murdoch Institute, is sort of technically doing a phase 3 trial looking at an old style of vaccine using an old TB vaccine to see it working in a similar sort of immunostimulatory and protective way. On follow 3, you'd follow the Moderna, the Pfizer, and Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccines as being closest to where we would assume that they would start into production. I'd pause there briefly and say that through the process of, particularly in the United States, of sort of the Operation Warp Speed, they not only factor into the development of the vaccine, but they also have to factor in the manufacturing and then the distribution and administration. Let's not forget that there's a timeline here which is not only crunched in terms of the scientific development, but because these are novel vaccines, we don't necessarily upfront have all the production capacity nor the method of distribution that we would typically have for, say, a novel flu vaccine. And so I wouldn't want people to forget that the same sort of development and sort of infrastructural changes are taking place there as well. Your second part of your question was on therapeutics. And I think that the top line is that there's really 2 therapeutics so far that have been sort of randomized placebo-controlled trials that have been efficacious. Remdesivir was the first of those to find successful, seems to be more successful in people who are hospitalized on sort of low level of oxygen support. It's not an outpatient drug, it's intravenous, at least it's not been studied there. Those trials are underway. And it is widely available in the United States. Still somewhat restricted under an emergency use authorization. Its availability outside the United States is a little more tenuous, I would say, at this point. The second therapeutic is dexamethasone. So in fact, a broad-acting steroid has been proven to be quite effective in hospitalized patients, particularly the most sick. And dexamethasone's advantage is that it's very widely available, it's cheap, although there was some nuance into the way that study based out of the UK enrolled people in that makes it a little bit harder to know exactly who to use it on. Topic, I think what's important to people to realize is that at the moment, there's no approved therapeutic for patients who are outpatients or who are well enough to be managed outside of the hospital or not on oxygen support. Now, that's not to say that steroids or remdesivir wouldn't help those individuals. They may well, but we just don't know. There are phase 2 to 3 developing antivirals that are in development for outpatient use, but we're yet to figure out whether they work. There's also a lot of work going into convalescent plasma and purified convalescent antibodies from individuals who have recovered that may be useful therapeutics in the outpatient space. But again, those trials are really only just getting underway. So lots of work ongoing. At the moment, relatively few answers on the therapeutic space, although we're much better than we were 6 months ago.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that all of this helps us set the stage then for perhaps a more in-depth conversation. So I want to, so a number of skeptics of challenge trials have suggested it's unlikely to save much or any perhaps time over a normal vaccine trial. And so I kind of wanted then to talk about that in the context of what we expect to get out of a challenge trial. Time savings would be one thing, and I hope we address that because that is something that is often mentioned. But as many of you have brought up, there may be other things that we learn from a challenge trial that we do not learn another type of trial. Another question that sort of keeps coming up, and I always like to joke that, you know, I became a lawyer so I didn't have to think about math, and here you guys are talking to me about statistical significance and stuff. But, you know, most of the time when I at least think we're talking about a couple of candidates, and here we have a whole bunch of vaccine candidates. And, you know, luckily some, or I mean, unluckily, countries like the US are cooperating in keeping their numbers high so that perhaps it's not an issue. But maybe one or all of you could speak to that question. What impact, if any, does the fact that there are so many candidates have on our ability to sort of find a significant result, especially if we're thinking about a vaccine that, you know, different numbers have been kicked around about effectiveness, rates ranging from 50 to 75% people have talked about. And so I'm just wondering sort of how that factors in to sort of the numbers aspect of all this. You guys can go in any order you like. I thought I could go back in the order we just went, starting back with Mark. But if anybody wants to grab my attention and cut in, do it.
Sure, I'll start, and I'm sure there will be other additions. So I think the main thing to understand about vaccines is that there are many suited for its purpose. And in this case, I think we would probably mostly agree that the ideal purpose for a vaccine is to create a sufficient degree of immunity in the population so that this is off the table as a daily threat. And whether we can accomplish that is an open question. In order to do that, and I would recommend the op-ed in this morning's Times by my longtime collaborator Rick Malley and Adam Finn that discusses this issue a bit. In order to do that, we need a vaccine that is affordable for a large fraction of the world. We need a vaccine that is highly effective, not only in preventing disease, which is what the phase 3 trials will likely measure most effectively, but also in preventing infection, or at least in preventing viral shedding, so that it helps to create herd immunity. So that immunizing me helps protect you. That only works if immunizing me make me less likely to transmit to you. We also ideally would have one that's usable without cold storage, that is, in order to make it more deliverable to large parts of the world, that is a single dose, especially for the short-term use. There are all sorts of things we want of a vaccine, and it would be unparalleled good luck if the first vaccines out of the gate all produce all of those things. And in fact, on the price issue, having multiple vaccines is a good in itself. And the other thing is we have to be able to manufacture enough for the globe, which is also something that's hard to imagine one vaccine doing. So there are all sorts of reasons why this sort of first round of vaccines is not the end of the story. We hope it's the very happy beginning to a story of vaccines, but we have no guarantee of that. And so in my mind, the real question is really, I mean, as Nir said, we wrote this article thinking maybe the world will manage to control this better than in the event it did. And so initially the idea was maybe there will be no cases by the time we have one vaccine. But I think there's a more reasonable case to be made that we will continue to need better and better vaccines over time, and this is one way to do it. And then the last thing I would say is, I mean, I don't love the idea of a challenge trial for its own sake. The idea is not that we want to make sure this happens. What we want to make sure of, we have adequate supplies of vaccines to protect the world. This is one means to that end. So if we have continuing ongoing transmission and we can solve the problem of learning what challenge trials are uniquely good at teaching us by other means, that's fine too. We were really, at least in my mind, the goal of defending the ethical acceptability is to say this is missions that we should prepare for because it's relatively cheap to prepare for, and goodness knows we need insurance against what's uncertain in the future.
Right. Nir, do you have anything to add to that?
First, just to second what Mark said on many fronts, including nobody would be happier if the phase 3 studies that go on now and successfully in very short time, and there would be a vaccine, at least for this short round, first round, it totally resolves the issue, or more or less gives challenge trials no added function, and that would be fantastic. My worry is about the realistic, not so great case, which they take long, they need to restart somewhere else. And in that case, there could be a very significant time delay. Colleagues, Pedro Rosa Diaz, a development economist, Ara Darzi, a global health leader, and myself calculate what would be the savings in terms of lives, in terms of years in poverty from expediting the arrival of a vaccine that is of the type that can reach herd immunity by just 1 month. A very, very conservative figure, on many fronts conservative, is that it would avert the loss of 720,000 years of life around the world, and importantly, 40 million years in poverty, the majority of which are concentrated in the developing world. So especially, and we're talking about dire poverty, not just the worst poverty described by the World Bank. So the great humanitarian value in expediting the process with reaching herd immunity is important indeed from an ethical standpoint to do that.
Okay, so just to make sure, so you would say that, look, we don't have to save a whole lot of time in order to have significant benefits. Is that? That's
true, and we don't know in which scenario we will be. It might turn out to be a whole lot of time.
Right. Okay, and it might turn out to be a whole lot of time. Okay.
There's also one last point, is that there, to the effect that challenge trials would also take a lot of time, is that there are preliminary preparations that are needed for challenge trials, and they do take some time. I think that there are some complications in the calculations that brought us these numbers, group working.
Can you, I'm sorry, can we have multiple requests from the audience for you to repeat those statistics? Would you be willing to say it again for us?
Sure. So a very conservative estimate, we had in mind the first generation vaccines. For second generation vaccines, it's more complicated, though, in a similar ballpark. Suggested for every month of savings of expediting the process, one would avert the loss of at least 720,000 years of life and 40 million years in poverty. I think 34 million out of which are concentrated in the developing world. I should really say it's a highly conservative calculation, not just because of the method, but also because it neglects a lot of channels towards saving lives and averting poverty on which we could not get numbers. So, for example, we completely neglect, for the purpose of that calculation, loss of life from avoidance of childhood vaccinations, of cancer care, of malaria treatment. These are big numbers, totally not inside that calculation. So I do think that this is a great understatement of how many lives you save, or how many lives you save, and how many years in poverty you avert if you expedite by just one. It is not just the direct deaths from COVID. It is so much more. It is famine, big numbers, which don't even go into this calculation.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dr. Wolfe, can you give us your take on what we might gain from a challenge trial, if anything?
Well, I'd certainly agree with both Nir and Mark in terms of the potential to shorten the timeline here. I think there's a couple of things that I would add to that. You know, it was hinted at earlier that we can certainly give early predictions as to when some of our current phase 3 trials are going to start showing results. But I think a lot of that is also predicated on how, ironically, how efficient we are at mitigating COVID around the world actually potentially slows our result finding here quite significantly. And so the other, heck, if you had asked me 4 or 5 months ago, I would have wished that we were not in the current situation where we still had plentiful enrollment and reasons to think that people, unfortunately, will get infected. But as we continue to get better mitigating actually against COVID in the general community, those phase 3 studies will presumably our ability to truly start seeing a separation, if one exists, between the protective efficacy that a vaccine will give and what we see from placebo is just going to take a longer block of time. So I think there's an advantage there that you can almost model, to be honest, within the realm and within the space of the sort of audience for whom you're vaccinating in a standard case. You can get your results in a meaningful fashion. It'll lengthen, I think, as we go, whereas a challenge study by its very nature is a well-defined set of time. And so you can better sort of delineate when you anticipate getting results. I think, there's other things here that can be valuable. Like we talk about, it was brought up earlier about the number of different vaccine candidates that are in early phases of trials. And I think one of the real difficulties is, they all need to be evaluated in their own right, and they often need to be compared against placebo groups. There are opportunities here to, in fact, combine placebo groups. You can use unified placebo groups to have cross comparisons of multiple vaccines in the same way, therefore actually reducing the number of people who need to be exposed under a challenge circumstance to live or attenuated viruses. I would counter that also, though, we haven't done challenge studies with coronavirus, or with this coronavirus at least yet. And I think there's a bit of lead time before we really get into the weeds of how quickly we could make this work, partly because there is selection of viral strain here that's really important. We think of COVID as one strain, and yet clearly little substrains are evolving across the community. And in fact, arguably, we would want to attenuate one before using it in a challenge setting. The second issue is that there's, I think, an unvalidated concern, but still exists, about sort of an inoculum effect with COVID, and understanding, sort of, for want of a better phrase, the right dose of virus to administer in such a way to engender an infection likely enough that we can see a result. That's a fine science to sort of figure out how much is safe enough to not make someone sick if there's a dose-related effect there. So there's a bit of water under the bridge to sort of prove exactly how this would take place.
Okay, wonderful. So I wanted to actually sort of back up a little bit because challenge trials are not a new thing. There is a history of them. And I think that we should talk a little bit about prior uses of challenge trials, when and for what they have used. And I guess I would especially invite you all to talk about, as I understand it, especially after Dr. Wolfe's comments about available treatments, in prior cases, at least according to what I read in the press, an effective treatment was available, and that's not the case here. So I guess, so one thing would be, is that second part correct? And if it is correct, how do we then nonetheless justify these ethics of a challenge trial under those conditions? Dr. Wolfe, I'll start with you if you don't mind, because you're already on screen and unmuted. So
yeah, no, I'm happy to go in there. I guess I'd push, I'm going to say challenge, but there's an irony to that phrase today, isn't it? I challenge you a little bit on the notion that previous challenge trials have only been with infections when there are treatments. A couple of examples come to mind. Let's take 3. So flu, for example, has a long history of challenge studies in multiple different countries and different settings, both to test drugs and vaccines. Plenty of other less severe respiratory viruses have challenge studies as well: respiratory syncytial virus, parainfluenza, rhinovirus. The typhoid vaccine was actually quite a well-known one too. And so typhoid, I think, is easy. We have a really good analytical way of figuring out what the right treatments there are, and it's an effective sort of treatment. So a lot of the ethical challenges here about is our treatment effective enough for COVID was not an issue there. But I'd take flu, for example, as a good comparator. While we traditionally think of influenza as not something that is life-threatening, or at least something that we have a very good sort of grip of the full extent of illness that it can produce, it's a bit of a long shot to say that the current flu treatments that exist are unifiably effective for everyone. Let's take Tamiflu, oseltamivir, for example. It's been around as a standard of care more than a decade now, and yet its efficacy is still under some question. It's clearly not a panacea as, you know, as good old penicillin is for bacterial infection. And so perhaps the bigger challenge here is not that we don't have efficacious therapies. We clearly have therapies that have some impact, as we do for flu. I think, to me, part of the bigger challenge here is that I don't fully necessarily understand the breadth of the immunologic implications that COVID can have, or that I can necessarily stand in front of someone clinically and say, I exactly know the outcome due to this virus. More so than my inability to have a treatment that I believe is 100%
Wonderful.
effective.
Thank you for that, Claire. Nir, if you don't mind, I'm going to go to you next. And in particular, so what impact does this notion, right, that we still don't fully understand the virus, what impact does that have then on, for example, getting informed consent from challenge trial volunteers? I know that you've thought about this issue, and so I thought this might be a good opportunity to invite you to address that. I'm sure that some of our audience members have questions about that as well.
Sure. If I could just start with a word on the previous question that Dr. Wolfe addressed. For me, the important question is not whether in our history, in ordinary times, we used challenges only for diseases that were either very mild or for which we had a rescue therapy. The question is whether what we should do in a point. The main response is not so much that, yeah, we did use challenge trials for dengue, which is probably an exception to that rule, or, you know, if you think about cases of myocarditis for flu, or the main response is in these extraordinary times, the business need to go to more fundamental principles of research ethics, of ethics in general, and see whether it would be okay to put people at potentially serious risk, serious harm in the circumstances. For that, we need to engage in the deeper discussion that we are having today, and hopefully we'll continue to develop it throughout the session. The point about informed consent is key. It matters that people are volunteering, potentially with full understanding, full voluntariness. I don't see any reason to expect that in this context they would be less informed. We'll discuss that in a minute, given the uncertainties. I wouldn't expect that they would be less informed in context of other decisions in research and in clinics on their care and on research participation. They approach us and give autonomous consent to helping us and taking on some risk. That matters. That helps somewhat legitimate that risk. An analogy is organ donation. Organ donation is not good for the donor. It would have been unethical without the donor's consent. The fact that there is consent, proper consent, autonomous consent, informed consent, surely helps some in justifying the potential harm to the donor through harvesting of organs. Similarly here, why assume that people couldn't give informed consent here? One argument that indeed was in the press was because researchers don't quite understand this disease yet. It's new, it's emerging. How can anybody be informed about it? It sounds right, but it's totally wrong. It's totally misconstruing what are the validity conditions for informed consent. What we need for valid informed consent is not for study participants to know the disease fully. That, if that were the case, then for diseases that we research that we did in the 70s, and for which different understanding of the disease, we would have to say that was battery back in the 70s because they had a misunderstanding of the facts. No, the idea is they need to understand what the researchers understand, or the main things about what the researchers understand. Certainly, the researchers shouldn't cheat them about what they understand. Things of that sort. And this could be achieved. In fact, it's easier when there is so little known. What they need to understand in some areas here would be something like, look, this is risky. We don't know exactly the implications. We thought it affects only the lungs. Now we see the effects of the lungs. We can't give you an exact figure. Even for young people, there have been cases, things of that sort. Do you understand? We check comprehension very well. If they pass comprehension tests, the way that the candidates for research pass for other research, I think this is no more problematic in terms of informed consent than other studies, and the informed consent could be part of the justification alongside, of course, the important moves to minimize the risks, for example, through participant selection of only young and healthy people, for example, by providing any available therapeutics at that time, and by providing close monitoring and immediate care upon any sign of infection or symptoms.
And Mark, to you, can you, is there anything that you can add in terms of this sort of historical look at challenge trials and how a COVID challenge trial would be either similar or different to those that have come before?
Yeah, I think I would mostly just agree with what's already been said, and maybe just add the notion that, for very good reasons, research ethics has certain kinds of protections in place, and we focus on those protections. But especially with the notion that this is an unusual situation, I think it's worth thinking about sorts of human activities where people take on risks that are not fully known to them, and for which we praise them and in fact recruit them. There's the title recruiter for the one that I have most in mind, which is the military. And it's not the case that we say in other areas of real taking on risks to life that we're cheating someone if we don't give them a future roadmap of what wars we're planning to get involved in, which of course we don't know. And yet we have military recruiters. We have people who much more close to home who are going into healthcare settings, often without PPE, and putting themselves at risk of infection. And we call that correctly a heroic and professionally praiseworthy act. And so I think we have to understand that research is different and acknowledge the history of the bad things that have happened in the name of research, but we also should consider it as one human activity where if people can be properly, if the safeguards can be properly fulfilled, as they must be to make this a legitimate activity, we shouldn't sort of treat it as though, because this is medical research, we have to tell them everything that could possibly happen in a way with formal probabilities, because no human activity, including getting a virus, is fully understood in that way. So I'd like to expand out the scope and think of this as a volunteering for one of these trials as an activity in itself that needs to be protected, but not in a way that makes it impossible.
Wonderful.
Lily,
Thank you.
I'd love to
Sorry,
add,
go ahead. Yeah,
just one comment to add here. When I hear a majority of people push back on me about the concept of a challenge trial, they almost always do so from a medical perspective of, isn't your first mission to do no harm? And that sort of comes up in a tough conversation, and yet I think it's always worthy to think of that, like, do no harm in regards to whom? We certainly have the obligation to the person in front of us who's volunteering, and I agree with Mark and Nia that to put safeguards in place of that as much as possible is absolutely appropriate. But I think sometimes put ourselves in a difficult position to begin with as clinicians when we use that as a sort of a rock, only thinking about one person in front of us, whereas clearly the entire point of or a major part of all vaccine effort is in fact do no harm includes my broader community. And I think sometimes putting ourselves out of our immediate clinician, sort of clinician to patient role as someone who's interested in vaccine trial work is important, because you get bogged down in it otherwise.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Okay, so this seems like a good, since we've been talking a little bit about ethics. If we were to have challenge trials, how would you like to see them constructed to ensure that they are ethical, that they're as safe as they can be, and that we generate scientifically information from them? And so again, Dr. Wolfe, I'll just start with you again because you're unmuted and on the screen. It seems like the efficient method.
I shouldn't have been. Well, look, some of this I guess we've covered. I'd want to be very clear here on a methodical approach to figuring out virus type to challenge with, dose to use, and to be very clear on what we want to monitor. And that is a broader range of things simply for a vaccine trial simply than does someone get sick or not. There's immunologic components here that are key to follow. There are side effect profiles here that are still frankly key to follow. Methods of differentiating side effects that may be immunologic due to the virus than immunologic due to the vaccine, which I think are very important. And there's also an understanding of which vaccine targets we want to have sort of in study, such that my earlier comment about potentially using groups to actually get a much quicker answer can actually be put into place. Obviously there's a whole barrage of biosafety questions that always come into play here too with these sorts of issues. And so, making sure you're using it in a facility that fully understands the implications from an infection control point of view of challenge studies is just vital. But most hospitals by this point in the pandemic are very adept at doing that. The statistics I might leave to my colleagues to answer that question.
Okay. Nir, and ethicists, what needs to happen to make a challenge trial ethical, as safe as possible, and
Exclusion criteria: people who are young adults, people without risk factors for sort of
and can you put, I'm sorry, what age range we're probably talking about? Under between 20?
A lot of groups have worked on this, and each group gave their own numbers. I'm a philosopher. It's not like I can derive from first principles the correct. It's 33 or so. I won't. People have recently talked about people in their 20s. Mark and I initially talked about 20 to 45, so not 18 to 20. We thought that they wouldn't give quite the same qualitative informed consent, but more on the side of putting people at higher risk, but more generalizable findings. And different countries will have different decisions on that. You can also go in different, different levels of demandingness on how free from risks do we exclude all men in our at higher risk, etc. High qualitative informed consent, not usual qualitative informed consent. I would want, ideally, a third party, something that doesn't really exist in medical trials as far as I know so much. Somebody who's not the researchers giving the kosher stamp and saying, this person is really comprehending. Because there is a lot at stake, and I don't want anybody entering this without fully comprehending. And we can afford to exclude some people who, on the face of it, look comprehending, because we have this kind of long lineup of volunteers from all over the world. And an advantage of challenge trials is that you need so few. So we should really focus on people who really get knowing into what they're getting. Isolated facilities where we would minimize risk of any infection to any third parties. access to the latest therapies, to critical care, even if those are in shortage. I think there is an ethical case for prioritizing these people even over, again, we're talking about a small number. I don't think there would be a major effect on the surrounding community. There's an international effort, a strong case for prioritizing them over other candidates. And there are a few bits and pieces that different people would add to that. There are some open questions. Maybe I shouldn't steal but there is debate, I think, about whether you pay volunteers. Probably everybody would agree that in the event of very rare event of an injury, there should be, full compensation, full, health insurance for life, things of that sort. Maybe an insurance scheme settled in advance. But do you pay them for their risk and effort and time lost?
I understand. I understand there's a nearly 200-page paper on SSRN about this question now, as of last week. I don't know if you were a part. Okay,
there's a
all right.
report written for the One Day Sooner for the volunteer organization by Holly Fernandez Lynch and others, if that's what you mean. On many other aspects of this.
Right. Mark, what would you like to see in a challenge trial, assuming we had them, to make sure that it's well conducted and meets your sort of ethical bar?
Yeah, I think most of the main ethical issues have been covered. I would say that in terms of answering the scientific and social value question, which is itself an ethical consideration, but also a further to maximize the scientific value, I think I'm writing something with a colleague about the need to really understand how and to what extent the infection is controlled by the vaccine rather than just the symptoms. And so a really intensive monitoring of the sort of probably every 12 hours or something, how much virus is being produced by the infected individuals if they get infected, or showing that they haven't gotten infected if they're vaccinated, is really crucial. And then I think so in terms of the scientific value, the sort of how the infection goes as a virologic event, not as a symptom event, is really important. And then I think getting back to something Dr. Wolfe mentioned, the issue of viral inoculum. So how much virus do you give a person, and is it enough so that in the people who don't get the vaccine, the infection rate, or do you titrate it down and have to use considerably more people in the trial, most of whom don't get infected, as an additional safety measure? I think that's an open question that Mrna and I have been working on as well and thinking about. I don't think that's been answered. That's one of the things I think that needs to be really worked out, and why we've been pushing so hard for the idea of comprehensive preparations for a challenge trial, because there are a number of these questions, many of which we've just talked about, that need to be settled, and they should be done not in a rush.
Right. Great. Well, our time has flown by. I'm going to ask just each of you to leave the audience with one or two sentences that you think they need to know about challenge trials, if you haven't gotten it out there yet. And Mark, let's start with you. You're already up there.
Okay.
Any last thought you want to leave people with? And it's okay if you don't have one too, by the way.
Yeah. I think challenge trials are one option, and one that can possibly provide information we can't easily get for a variety of reasons. Preparing for them and setting up the institutional and scientific and infrastructure requirements to do it is very valuable. And if we get a vaccine or enough vaccines without, then all the better.
Okay. Cameron Wolfe, any last thoughts that you have?
No, I'd really back up off what Mark had said, which is to at least be open to this. I don't see it as being ethically or medically that different than where we've been for so many other challenge studies that we've already had. And Nia mentioned it beautifully. Like, we are in a unique situation right now where to be frank, that requires unique solutions. And I think this is well within the spectrum of what would be a suitable solution to accelerating our vaccine success.
Great. And last word.
I would urge everybody, the idea of challenge trials is so counterintuitive. So we have this, I continue to have this initial scared kind of gut about it. And certainly a doctor who is practicing beneficence every day, it's just very, not natural. We should think with our intellect a bit about this. Think about whether we're not posing conditions for the justifiability of challenge trials, that things like organ donation, phase 1 studies on healthy volunteers, and indeed the phase 3 studies going on right now on first-in-human vaccine candidates, which have some uncertain risks from potential severity enhancement, from toxicity. Are we not setting up that no activity and no trial, including very legitimate ones that we would endorse every day, would meet? So we should be fair on challenge trials when we assess them, and think with an open mind about the global community, not just the people who we will see in the room, but everybody around the world who will be affected. If there are severe risks from COVID, that just means that there are severe risks for millions and billions of people potentially around the world. Think about it from a somewhat public health point of view. That I think is important.
Great, wonderful. Well, I'm very grateful to all of you, audience members and panelists who have joined us for this conversation today. A special thank you to our 3 panelists for taking time out of their busy day and for being so enlightening and so engaging. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and stay safe.